That title is very, very deliberate. And it speaks to why I wanted to come up with the course in the first place. So, I mean, on a certain level, the course emerged from getting to know my students at S&T, which is, it's an engineering school, and I think that it has a higher propensity, if I would bet, of students who, play video games regularly, who are, make that a kind of part of their identity. And in the first year that I taught there, a lot of students asked me about, oh, I mean, have you played Hearts of Iron 4, or, do you know this or that game, and or this thing that you told me about reminds me of something that I read on a Hoi 4 Reddit or something. And I'm like, okay, well, clearly there's an interest here in historical video games. I've had a historical interest in historical video games since basically I started playing video games. I grew up with Europa Universalis 1 and 2, and the original Age of Empires and Age of Empires 2 and stuff like this. So there was already sort of common ground that I could see that was fertile here for cultivating relationships between me and my students, and getting engineers, principally who I teach, more invested in history as a discipline, as a concept, as a way of thinking. Um, but so in the course of trying to imagine what a history video game based class would be like, I had another goal, and an even deeper goal, which is I wanted to use it not as like simply a kind of lure, like putting a pie under a box and having the students come and get trapped in there and suddenly they're in a history class, but using it as a vehicle, unwittingly on their part, for infiltrating in kind of Trojan horse is the metaphor I often use, for infiltrating in concepts in the philosophy of history, and introducing students who otherwise would never get introduced to the idea of historiography, which we can get into later. And so it is a history course first and foremost. It is a high concept history course, but it is done through video games because I think introducing these concepts through video games is easier, and we can talk about why that is. So in designing the course, I wanted to be very, very picky about what I would call it. And I think that, when I would first workshop the idea to people, they'd hear history, they'd hear video games, and they're like, oh, you're going to do history through video games. Or sometimes they'd say, oh, you're going to do the history of video games. That is not what this course is about. I mean, you kind of get some of those things, but that's not the point. The point is to understand the nature of, or explore the nature of, the representation of the past, historical representation. And so we're using video games to look at, on a kind of mechanical, conceptual, literary level, how history is reconstructed, how it is put into a medium, and how people interact with it in that way. And so it has bigger ambitions than just looking at video games. It's a kind of a media studies class. It's a kind of media literacy, but it's also a philosophy of history class. And so that's what I mean, that's the core phrase here. And sometimes, you know, not everyone I talk to kind of picks up on that at first, which is understandable, but I try to, make it very clear that no, this is about historical representation, not trying to use video games to, teach the subject matter in the same way that I would in a normal setting. And we can talk about why that distinction is so important, if you like.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And so the way I'm understanding it right now is that it's not so much that you would use Assassin's Creed 2, for example, to teach students about the Italian Renaissance. Instead, you're using that as an example of how that time period is depicted within this source being the video game, how
Yeah,
they
yeah.
choose to represent that history.
Yeah, that's much closer to it. You're right. I don't use these games to, like you say, uh, like with Assassin's Creed. No, I mean there are many things about Assassin's Creed and the Assassin's Creed series which have their virtues for trying to do that in a certain way, but it's I would say this course is not even really about any specific time period, but trying at a very high level of abstraction, getting students to think about, for example, when I do have the students play Assassin's Creed 2, that's one of the three games that I've assigned in the course, and they have to complete a project for that unit. Um, and the way that I structure the course is that it's broken into three units. based on historical perspectives. So one of the questions I had in coming up with the course is, how do you divide it? Do you do it by genre? Do you do it by some kind of historical thematic focus? But what I decided to do is by perspective. So this is the micro, the meso, and the macro perspective based on the sort of field of vision and the subjectivity of who or what you play as in the game, what kind of power you have over the world and your place in the world that is represented. So a game like Assassin's Creed is a first person game in that you are playing as a single individual, although it is shot from a third person perspective, so from behind the character. But in historical terms, I think of it as a micro game because you only are one historical actor, right? You don't control a group of people, you don't control an entire planet or anything like that. You are one person, although that person in Assassin's Creed is always basically a superhuman, well, it's a virtual representation of a superhuman assassin, whatever. When they complete that project on this perspective, I ask them in their, based on their playthrough of Assassin's Creed 2, what does the fact that you are this person, and in particular in Assassin's Creed 2, that's the character Ezio, who has all these, like all the characters do in Assassin's Creed, these fantastic powers of parkour and fantastic violence, and have this kind of superhuman ability. The fact that you are this one actor in this representation of Florence for the most part, and that you have all these abilities, how does that fact seem to shape or force or distort or give advantages to the way that history itself is represented in the game? So that can be, if the students want to, they can talk about, well, this means that certain details are left out. Like, we've got the Duomo, but everything else in Florence is kind of generic. All the people are generic because, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to interact with them very much. They're just kind of background there. Or like the buildings are modified in such a way as to have very convenient footholds. And there's always like a hay cart that you can go hide in, and things like this, that the world has been kind of structured around the nature of the player, and then that means that the representation itself is somehow warped or modified to suit the fact that you are this particular person. So it's not even so much about a specific period of time or what is the time that is purported to be represented in the game, but kind of on a mechanical level, a structural level, a meta historical level, how video games force the representation of the past in certain ways.